Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that very strong statement. I wholeheartedly agree with you on the issue of sexual harassment and what the agency needs to do to better manage and train and skill people in responding to these issues. I also appreciate your very strong statement about drones. As we approach this fire season, making sure that those on the fire line have the best possible information is going to be critical on weather conditions, on information about fire movement, on all of that. And recently attended a breakfast where the Secretary of Ag was entering into an MOU. The Department of Interior has done unbelievable work on our drone system. I don't want the Department of Ag to waste 1 minute recreating something that could just be the same implementation that the Department of Interior has done. So I hope that they will work on that. So I also thank you for this time. I wanted to get started on the release over the weekend by the Interagency Fire Center. For years now, the committee has heard over and over that our wildfires are getting worse, and climate scientists have been telling us the fire season is getting longer and hotter. And now this new forecast in the Pacific Northwest will have a July-August fire season on the side of what we have seen in the past being even potentially worse. Most of the West received less than 50% of its average precipitation for May, which will likely result in fuels in the mountains becoming critically dry by late July. My colleague, Senator Wyden, and I were just discussing this as it relates to what that means for us anytime that less precipitation, just a sooner, drier environment in which we all have to be very, very mindful of. Nearly all of the country experienced temperatures that were 2 to 6 degrees above average last month. Central Washington temperatures were 10 degrees above average. And because these conditions are supposed to last through September, places like Southeast Washington will likely experience more large fires than they have in previous years starting in July. Areas in Washington, and I know that we have a couple of fires already started in our state. Hopefully people will be working very quickly to put those out, but it's just a very early reminder of how challenging this season could be. Areas in Washington and in Oregon, and I know my colleague will be here probably from Idaho, and in Idaho, east of the Cascade Crest will likely experience more large fires than we have seen in the last few years starting in August. So given that we are looking at this summer, I want to make sure that we are ensuring that firefighters have every tool available to them to help fight these fires. They need to be as safe as possible and as efficient as possible. Everyone here has heard me talk about the Carlton Complex fire we had in Washington a few years ago, where 149,000 acres burned up literally in a single day. The following year, the fires in Washington were even worse, and we witnessed firsthand the disaster and what the aftermath means for people living in these communities. Our heroic men and women firefighters did everything they could to be ready, and we need to do everything we can to be ready this fire season. Fires are becoming more lethal, and part of the speech that Chief Christensen gave during last week's Wildland Fire Conference, one of the facts she mentioned really struck me, and that was since 1910, we've had more than 1,000 deaths from wildland fires, but the more sobering number is more than a quarter of those, 255, have occurred in the last 15 years. So we can see that they literally are becoming more lethal. So when we get to questions, I'm definitely going to ask about our efforts on modernization. We want to make sure that every tool is there for our wildland firefighters, as I said, with information. We also want to make sure that our modernized fire shelters are developed and implemented in a way that we know that the safety and training of those wildland firefighters have an understanding of that equipment. We had a very unfortunate death in the 30 Mile fire in which the then deployment of shelter wasn't really successfully deployed, and the tragic loss of life in the Pacific Northwest. So as you now deploy new shelters and wildland firefighters with very few hours of literal training compared to our permanent firefighting force, we want to make sure that everybody is trained and adequate, and also not an over expectation of being someplace that they shouldn't be. So we want to work with you on that. We also want to have more hasty response to wildfires. Firefighters need to be able to use those technologies that give them the most efficient resource. And we also want to be very strategic about protecting these communities that are in the wildland urban interface as soon as possible. In March, Congress took an important step by addressing the problem, and members of this committee worked very hard on an omnibus bill dedicated to wildfire, and many of the people here in this room worked very hard on that. This helps the Forest Service have adequate resources to respond to wildfires and do their necessary work, and we provided significant funding for firefighting for the next 10 years and to get out of the fire borrowing. So I hope that there is enough funding that is there on the non-fire programs that can benefit our communities as well, especially the increase in funding that will help us do prevention and treatment in advance and prevent the loss of the Forest Service non-fire accounts. So what was included in that package that we think make things easier? Obviously, our state agencies like Washington DNR are able to partner better with the Forest Service. We hope you take advantage of that. They were called out last time, I think the first time in decades that DNR was called to the line. That's how bad the fire season was. We hope that the Good Neighbor projects are implemented. We hope that the vegetation management and power lines is implemented. We hope the 20-year contracts to do thinning and prone forests on cross-laminated timber are implemented. And we hope the Forest Service will do all the things it can to reduce fuels in advance. I want to highlight that this interesting article just showed up in this month's Journal of Forestry, which basically shows that the research shows that per acres burned on a wildfire in August puts more than 5 times as much smoke as a controlled burn in May and June. Now, I know that this probably makes sense to people, but at the same time, this is one of the dilemmas we've been fighting. I guarantee you, if you asked people in Puget Sound, would you tolerate a little bit of smoke in those months to reduce the constant summer-wide haze that was then present because of fire? I guarantee you, they would say, yes, let's do the prescribed burning in the months that are wet, that help us control these burns in the most significant way. So obviously we have more work to do on that, but I think that article showed us that this is the most wise spending that we could do, and we just need to push through on this. So I will be asking also Chief Christensen about the shift to contracts for 35% of the air tankers and water scoopers, including Aeroflight in Spokane and others, to a call when needed. I want to make sure that you have every tool available to you, but I want to make sure we're not just going with one source of resource just because it's a larger pot of money. I would feel better sleeping at night that you had every tool available. We know that the water does not put out the fire, that the larger retardant does, but with this many fire starts in this dry of season and communities that are so stretched, and when the entire upper part of northwest Washington and northeast Washington was on fire, basically, you know, communities were defending themselves. Having that kind of air ability to help mitigate is so, so important to these communities. So I understand that. Well, we'll get to the air tankers. I've been long here, but I just want to say that last year, fire managers requested but did not receive an air tanker 371 times because none were available. So I get that your goal is to have the most resources. I want you to have the most resources too, but I don't want you to have to give up one for the other. So let's work together on figuring out how we get you both in what is going to continue to be a challenging fire season. Madam Chair, we just can't work fast enough. The changing climate and environment is making fire a more challenging environment for our Forest Service, for our wildland firefighters, for our communities. We put a down payment on, but we need to do so much more. And so I thank everybody and thank you for having this important hearing today.